Hello, my name is Nicholas Morton, and in this talk I'm going to be thinking about shipping in the Mediterranean at the time of the Crusades. And in particular, I'm going to focus on the Eastern Mediterranean at this time. Okay, so I want to start quite a long time before the Crusades, really, in the late 900s. Because at this time, the Mediterranean, both the West and the East, were dominated by fleets from North Africa and also from the Umayyad Caliphate in what today would be central and southern Iberia, Spain. And at this time, it was these fleets that dominated the commerce, but also the military activity in this era. But then shortly after the first millennium, into the 1020s, 1030s, that sort of era, increasingly the sea lanes become contested by fleets from the northern Italian cities of Pisa, Genoa and Venice. And fairly swiftly, these fleets come to achieve a position of dominance, particularly in the Western Mediterranean, but then later on in the 11th century in the Eastern Mediterranean as well. Then, in the 1090s, there is the advent of the First Crusade. Now, the First Crusade, for the most part, travelled overland on its journey to Jerusalem. But there were various supply fleets that supported the Crusade, but also many of these Italian cities, these big mercantile powers, sent fleets to support the Crusade either during its progress or shortly after the conquest of Jerusalem. Now, these big Italian fleets from places like Pisa and Genoa, they were interested in the Crusade's spiritual goals, but they were also aware that the Eastern Mediterranean is also extremely important commercially. After all, the big Silk Roads that come out of Central Asia and China and then pass south of the Caspian and north of the Syrian desert will then ultimately reach the Eastern Mediterranean coastline at ports like Beirut, Tyre, Acre, Jaffa, among others, so that these merchants can then sell their goods into the Mediterranean trade. And so the Italian merchants come in fairly swiftly after the First Crusade and establish significant holdings in the big port cities along the Levantine coast, which form part of the rapidly expanding Crusader states of this era. Now, they're not the only naval power in the Eastern Mediterranean. Prior to the First Crusade, the dominant naval power had been the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt, which had a substantial fleet. And yet, following the First Crusade, the Italian fleets, in a series of naval encounters, defeat various Fatimid squadrons until the Eastern Mediterranean is very much controlled by these Italian cities. Another crucial development in this process is the conquest of the various cities along the Levantine coast, because these deny the Fatimids places where they can re-water or resupply their ships, as these cities fall under the control of the Crusader states. So by about 1120, 1130, around that kind of time, the Fatimids' naval activities become a great deal more constrained. There are various naval encounters in later decades, but really from this moment the Italians have the upper hand decisively in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so for almost 2 centuries, the main traffic is very large ships carrying goods, crusaders, pilgrims, settlers to the Crusader states and then returning with goods and travellers as well. And this becomes a crucial umbilical cord supporting the Crusader states, supplying them with the personnel and the resources they need in order to expand and then to build up their position in the Levantine coast. Having said that, there is still warfare, but it's not warfare between the Italians and the Fatimid Empire or other Muslim territories in the region. There's always a great deal of competition between these Italian cities, and occasionally this competition breaks out into violence. And so a series of trade wars take place during the 12th and 13th century. A particularly vicious one broke out starting in the port of Acre in 1256, which would later expand to include all 3 of the really big trading cities of this era. And the violence didn't just remain centred in Acre itself, but spread across the Mediterranean as these cities fought fleet actions against each other for control over the crucial commercial hubs of the Mediterranean. As the 13th century progressed, though, it wasn't just these three Italian cities that dominated the area. Many other cities also became important commercial powers. Marseille in southern France became very important, as did Barcelona in northern Iberia. Other merchants were also based in the big port cities of Sicily and also southern Italy. And so many powers came to play a role in the evolving commerce of the 13th century. And then, at the end of the 13th century in 1291, with the fall of the Crusader states, this again changes the nature of shipping, it changes the nature of trade in this era. And one of the key developments is the rise of the various beyliks in Anatolia, the most famous of which is the Ottoman beylik, which would in time become the Ottoman Empire. And these Turkish beyliks become very powerful in Anatolia, but they also set about trying to exert their influence in the Aegean Sea as well. And so a new wing in the various conflicts and naval wars of this era emerges in the Aegean Sea as these Turkish beyliks begin to contest control over the islands and seaways in that area against the Italian cities, but also the military order of the Knights Hospitaller, which after its expulsion from the Crusader states with the fall of the Crusader states in 1291, briefly set up home on the Isle of Cyprus, but then later on, between 1306 and 1310, conquered and then established its headquarters on the island of Rhodes, which from then on became a base of corsair activity against the various Muslim territories in the eastern Mediterranean. And then beyond that, you have the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which in time will become a very powerful maritime empire, which controls much of the eastern Mediterranean and later on into the early modern period, much of the western Mediterranean as well, but that lies beyond the scope of this talk. Okay, so that's just a whistle-stop tour of the Mediterranean region and its broad history during the period that we're looking at here. Let's talk a little bit about the types of ship that you would find in the Mediterranean during this time. Well, perhaps the most important type of ship, because it was central for trade, but also for the support of the Crusader states, and we're focusing on the Crusades here, so this is an important point, is a ship called the naves, which basically just translates as ship. And these would have been very large ships, quite wide, quite long, quite strong, powered generally by sail, and these would be the big transport carriers that would transport trade goods and people around the Mediterranean. And these could be very large. Even at the time of the First Crusade, they could carry several hundred people. But by the late 12th century, there are reports of them carrying over 1,000 people. In the 13th century, the Templars had a vessel called the Falcon, which was said to be able to carry 1,500 people. Now, whether that's accurate is difficult to say, but we need to get hold of the idea that these ships could be very large and carry large numbers of people, and that includes some people, elite travellers, in a fair degree of comfort. So very large ships indeed. And focusing on the Crusader states, these naves, these bulk carriers, were particularly important because these were the ships that carried the resources the Crusader states needed in order to survive and then later on to maintain themselves. And it's these ships also that carried the various goods from the Silk Roads or from the spice routes across the Mediterranean to places like the Byzantine Empire, North Africa and Western Christendom, bringing then goods in return. And this trade was very lucrative. It was so lucrative that in fact various powers tried to ban trade, particularly trade in weapons. So the papacy on several occasions banned the export of weapons to Muslim powers in the Mediterranean region, and some of the big commercial cities that were linked to the Mediterranean trade, places like Damascus, also banned the export of weapons to the Crusader states because, again, they didn't want to encounter them on the other side of the battlefield. So those are the naves, the great ships of this era. Another very different type of ship is galleys. And galleys were much longer, much narrower, much lighter, and they were built for speed, because galleys were the main weapon of war in the Mediterranean in this era. They were typically powered by both rowers and by sails. Rowers can give an incredible turn of speed, particularly in combat, and so that was very important. Of course, if a ship's being rowed rather than sailed, it can also move directly into the wind's eye, which of course a sailing ship can't, which gives it greater mobility. And so galleys, these were the main warship, and their main armaments were frequently crossbowmen, but there were nastier weapons too, and there are reports of bags of powdered lime being released upwind of rival ships, and that lime would then catch in the wind and be blown down onto the enemy ship, and of course if lime gets into your eyes then you go blind. One particularly famous weapon during this era, which was carried on Byzantine fleets, was Greek fire, and this weapon consisted of a mix of chemicals that could be ignited and then projected against other ships, and of course ships are very vulnerable to fire, and so this weapon can be very effective at burning down enemy fleets. Although notably the Crusaders or Franks didn't tend to use Greek fire on their ships. Some ships also mounted catapults on their decks, which again gave them greater power in warfare, and so these were the main weapons of war in the Mediterranean, and it's these ships that were the great threat to the naves, to the great ships of this time, although often galleys had difficulty actually sort of getting access to these ships, because galleys often didn't have greater freeboard, and by freeboard that's the space between the level of the water and the level of the deck. Often their freeboard wasn't more than a few feet, whereas the great ships could rise meters out of the water, so often it was quite difficult to get access to the great ships when they tried to tackle them in combat. But these galleys were the main weapons of war. Later on, towards the very end of this period, they would also be equipped with cannon, but that really was a development for much later. So the galleys themselves, they take two primary forms during the 12th and 13th century particularly, and those two forms are biremes and triremes. Now, a classical trireme, for example, would have 3 banks of oars with 1 rower per oar. It's a little different in the medieval period. Here we're talking about 1 very large oar being pulled by 3 rowers, and that's why it would be a trireme, so tri meaning 3. And so a bireme would be the same, but with two rowers on that particular oar. Now, a common problem facing all the ships of this era is the sailing seasons, because this is an age where the weather conditions can be too strong for the ships built at this time, particularly in the winter months. So typically from around October to March, ships didn't typically sail in the Mediterranean except in extreme emergencies. And the reason for this is that they are still quite fragile, and heavy weather could cause them to break up, or in the case of galleys, could sink them entirely. With such a low freeboard, galleys could be very easily swamped even by a moderate sea swell, and so that was a particular consideration for them. So this was an important point for the Crusader states, because it meant that for about half the year they couldn't expect supply from Western Christendom, and they had to survive on their own resources. And so a recurring theme in the surviving texts from the Crusader states is looking towards the arrival of the first ships in March-April time, who will then bring in the next wave of settlers or crusaders or resources or trade goods that they are looking for in order to sustain themselves. Another type of ship that warrants attention is horse transports, and these seem to have become larger and more capable as this period went on. So where initially they might have carried only a few horses, by the end of this period they're carrying many more. And that raises an interesting series of questions. How do you transport a horse? Because a horse can't just stand on a ship's deck. The rolling of the ship will cause the horse to fall over, and then it could break its legs. Also, there is the question of how do you disembark a horse? And so these were problems that medieval shipwrights really tried to tackle. Now, the way to transport a horse by ship is to suspend the horse with slings around its chest and to lift the horse up from the deck. So the horse's hooves aren't actually touching the deck at all. And the idea then is that the horse will swing with the motion of the ship and it won't then break its legs. The problem with that is that, of course, the horse will lose condition very, very quickly if it's not using its leg muscles. And so horse transports particularly have to travel from port to port, island to island with very short stages of journey, because it can't afford for the horse not to be exercised regularly. Otherwise the horse's muscles may reach a state where the horse can no longer stand. Another consideration here is getting the horse off the ship. And some of the more sophisticated horse transports of this era actually had stern doors which could be swung open to allow the horse to disembark into the water and then either swim to shore or just walk or just wade through the shallows until it reaches the beach. And so these stern doors could be swung closed and then they'd be corked to make sure that they were watertight. But this is how you transport a horse in the medieval era. It has to be said that as the ships get bigger during this era and as they become more competent, increasingly where, say at the time of the First Crusade, ships would have to take on various stops on the journey to the Crusader states from places like southern Italy or Sicily, increasingly they can take much larger hops between waypoints as they become more capable of covering long distances. Which brings me neatly on to the next point to think about, which is navigation. How did ships navigate during this era? Now, we're familiar today with things like the compass or the maritime chart, but in fact these were both developments that reached the Mediterranean in this era. The magnetic compass reached the Mediterranean from China in the late 12th century, but really took off in the 13th century. The maritime chart developed in the Mediterranean Sea area in the mid-13th century, and these became crucial navigation aids. Prior to this, navigation could be done by the stars, but also just by the experience of sailors who have travelled a particular route many times, who would then know the direction they needed to head in order to reach their port of destination. And so with these various developments taking place during the medieval period, ships becoming more competent, ships becoming stronger, better able to withstand high seas, navigation becoming more sophisticated, you do begin to get ships travelling further afield. And so it's very interesting that in 1291, the Vivaldi brothers from Genoa set out on an expedition around the west coast of Africa. Now, we know nothing further about that expedition. We don't know how far it got, we don't know what happened to it. But it is interesting that as the ships in the Mediterranean become better able to withstand serious sea conditions, the ships start ranging more widely, and this of course will set up the later period where ships and fleets from Western Christendom will range across the globe. Okay, so far we've talked primarily about ships across the Mediterranean, but there's also a great deal of trade and warfare that takes place in the rivers of this region. And I want to focus in particular here on the Nile, because on two occasions during the Fifth Crusade, between 1217 and 1221, and then during the Seventh Crusade, which covered the period from 1249 to 1254, both these crusades included expeditions into the Nile Delta. The basic strategy they were adopting was to try and conquer Egypt with all its enormous agricultural wealth in the Nile Delta and its major trading cities. And then with that wealth, that would then fund the permanent conquest of Jerusalem. And so Egypt becomes a primary target for crusading armies of this era. And actually both the Fifth Crusade and the Seventh Crusade follow a fairly similar course. They both try and take the coastal city of Damietta. The Fifth Crusade takes a long time to conquer the city. The Seventh Crusade takes it far faster. And then in both cases, armies then advance up the Nile to the town of Mansoura, where in both cases they were blocked from advancing any further. Now, what's crucial in these campaigns is the riverine dimension. the importance of river combat in the progress of these crusades. One example of this is that during the Fifth Crusade, various big naves, so big ships, were bound together with ropes and then had siege towers built on their decks in order to assault some of the coastal fortifications around Damietta. And so you've actually got floating siege towers created by the Italian cities as part of the crusade. Also, then, during the advance of both crusades up the Nile towards Cairo, the Crusaders sought to supply themselves by ship as they advanced on land up towards Cairo. And so what they typically did was to send naves supported by various galleys up the Nile, carrying the resources and troops they needed. And so naturally a key question for the Ayyubids, who were the ruling power in Egypt at this time, their main consideration was to try and break that crucial logistics link between the Mediterranean coast and the advancing Crusade army, because they knew that if they could break that link, they could stop ships getting through to the crusading army. The crusading army would then have to retreat. And it's a feature of both those crusades that the Ayyubids successfully managed to defeat and to break the supply lines trying to reach the crusading army. And this goes a long way to explaining why in both cases the crusading army had to retreat and never got near its ultimate target in Cairo. And so riverine warfare could be very important and indeed decisive in these cases in the progress of crusades. Another dimension to the history of the Eastern Mediterranean at this time is small ships, coastal shipping. In fact, this is an important feature of both the Western and Eastern Mediterranean, because we've talked about big ships and warships so far, but these wouldn't have been the most common types of ship in this era. Coastal shipping is crucial, and a great deal of trade and transportation takes place within a few miles of the coast, because particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean, when the heat of the day gathers and the air rises above the land as it warms up, bringing in the cooler air from the sea, that creates a convectional wind, which then smaller coastal ships can use to move up and down the Levantine coast. And so coastal shipping is a crucial feature of the medieval era, and a lot of trade goods and people are carried by these small ships. In the Eastern Mediterranean itself, coastal shipping was important for a whole range of reasons. One reason was the need for resources in specific areas. And so, for example, Egypt had very little iron and timber during the medieval era, and it relied on iron and timber to be brought by coastal ship from the north, from Cilician Armenia, from the wooded slopes of the Amanus and Taurus mountains, and then brought by ship down the coast to Egypt. Iron could be brought the same way. And these are just two examples of many different commodities that could be brought across the region by coastal shipping. Another consideration here is shipbuilding timber. And again, a great deal of emphasis was placed on maintaining trade routes with areas that could supply good quality shipbuilding timber. And again, Cilician Armenia and southern Anatolia were particularly good for this because their wood was so resinous, which made for very good watertight timber with which to make ships. Finally, I want to talk about the transmission of technology and change and different approaches to maritime architecture. Now, I've already mentioned that some developments and some technologies reached the Mediterranean from China, gunpowder and the maritime compass being two clear examples. But many technologies and developments, both incremental and significant, took place in the Mediterranean itself. I've already mentioned the maritime chart. And I think a crucial way of looking at this is just the exchange of ideas across the region's various different civilizations, because you have the Byzantine Empire in the Aegean, you have Islamic North Africa, including Egypt, and also parts of Spain as well. You have Western Christendom, and then you have the exchange of traders and merchants between all these various regions. and it seems that a great many ideas and technologies were exchanged as ships brought cargoes and people from one port to another, creating an area where there was a great deal of dynamism in the development of new ideas and new technologies. Okay, I do hope you found this talk interesting. Please do look at the other talks in this collection.